Now, one of the common mistakes that we all make is we fall into the trap of what I call when and then thinking. When and then thinking. In other words, when such and such happens, then I'll be happy. And you have done this all your life, and so have I. We fall into this when and then thinking. When I get into college, when I get married, when I have a baby, when I get a job, when my kids are born, when my kids leave the house, when and then thinking, then I'll be happy. Last week I shared with you 5 laws of happiness, and one of them is that happiness is a choice. You're as happy as you choose to be. If you're unhappy, you can't blame anybody for your unhappiness, because happiness is a choice. You don't go looking for happiness, you create it. It is something you create. And happiness, by the way, is not a goal. We talked about this last week. It is the byproduct of right thinking and right acting. Now, there are 4 common barriers to happiness. I want you to just write these down at the top of your notes there. 4 common barriers. I call these the killjoys of life, because when any of these enter into your life, then they're going to rob your happiness unless you're prepared for them. The first one, of course, is pain. Pain is a killjoy. It's hard to be happy and in pain at the same time. But there's another one, and you're familiar with this one too. I call it picky people. Picky people. People of all kinds, actually, can cause you to lose your joy. They can be irritating, they can be demanding, they can be uncooperative, they can be arrogant. People are a common killjoy in life. Number 3, pressure. Pressure can cause you to lose your happiness. And you can have pressure from within yourself, or you can have it around you. It can be internal or it can be external. And then number 4, and one you're all familiar with, of course, is problems. Problems. And there are all kinds of problems. So pain, people, pressures, and problems all are what I call the killjoys. Now, in Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 down to about verse 30 or so, Paul talks about all 4 of these killjoys. And we have an example of how to be happy no matter what's going on in your life. Now, I want to remind you that Paul, when he writes this book, the happiest book, he's in prison. He's in prison in Rome. In fact, the last 4 years of Paul's life had gone like this before he wrote this happiest book in the Bible. He spent 2 years in jail in Caesarea on false charges. 2 years in jail for false charges. Then he is sent on the way to Rome, and he is shipwrecked in the Mediterranean Ocean on the way to Rome, and he ends up on a desert island in the Mediterranean. And he's stranded there for a while with some people. And while he's there are some snakes, poisonous snakes on that island. He actually gets bit by a snake while he's there. Then he's imprisoned again for another 2 years in Rome with a guard chained to him 24 hours a day. So he has no privacy at all. He's in prison in Rome with a Praetorian guard, because he was such an important prisoner, chained to him 24 hours a day. He has no privacy. Now, Paul has every reason to be bitter. He has every reason to be unhappy. He has every reason to be depressed and have a pity party. Instead, he writes this book on happiness and on joy. Now, let me read you today's text. It's Philippians 1:12-30. It starts like this. I want you to know, dear brothers and sisters, Paul's writing, that everything that has happened to me has helped me to spread the good news. For everyone here, including all the soldiers in the palace guard, know that I am in chains because of Christ. And I have gained confidence. And because of my imprisonment, many of the Christians here have gained confidence and become more bold in telling others about Christ. Now, some are sharing Christ out of jealousy and rivalry. He's talking about the people who are outside. But others preach Christ with pure motives, and they love me, and they know that the Lord brought me here to defend the good news. But there are those who do not have pure motives as they preach about Christ. And they preach with selfish ambition, and they're not sincere, intending to make my time in prison more painful to me. But whether or not their motives are pure, the fact remains that the message about Christ is being preached, so I rejoice. And I will continue to rejoice no matter what. For I know that as you pray for me, he's writing to people in the Philippi, the church in a city in Greece called Philippi. It's called Philippians. If he's writing to us, it'd be First Californians. For I know, he says, that you are praying for me, and as the Spirit of Jesus helps me, this will all turn out for my deliverance. And I live in eager expectation and hope. And then he says, I want my life to always honor Christ, whether I live or I die. For to me, living is for Christ, and dying is even better. If I live, it just means more fruitful service, years of service for Christ, but I'm often torn between two desires. Sometimes I want to live, and sometimes I long to go on and be with Christ in heaven. That would be far better for me. But it's better for you if I live, so that you can grow and that you can experience the joy of your faith. But whatever happens, you must live in a manner worthy of the good news about Christ. Don't be intimidated by your enemies. It will be a sign to them of their downfall that God's with you and that he will save you. For you have been given not only the privilege of trusting in Christ, but also the privilege of suffering for him. And we are in this fight together. You've seen me suffer for Christ in the past, and you know that I am still in the middle of a great struggle. Now, that's a very warm, personal note that Paul's writing. This is a very personal book. This letter he's writing to his friends in the church of Philippi that he started. And in this passage, he covers these 4 different killjoys. And he talks about how he has dealt with them, how he's maintained his happiness in spite of everything going in ways he hadn't planned. Now, the key verse in this whole passage I just read is verse 27. It's there on your outline, and it says this: whatever happens, conduct yourself in a manner worthy of the good news of Christ. So in this passage, we learn how to be happy no matter what, even if you're in prison in Rome. And Paul models 4 habits. Let's get right into it. Number 1, I can be happy no matter what happens in my life if, number 1, I look at every problem from God's viewpoint. If I look at every problem from God's viewpoint. You see, happy people have a larger perspective. They have a bigger worldview. They see the big picture. When I don't have the big picture, when I don't see things from God's point of view, I get discouraged, I get frustrated, I get unhappy. The reason we get unhappy is because we don't see what God does. Now, the truth is, no matter what's going on in your life, the good, bad, and the ugly, God is working out a plan. And he even takes all of our mistakes and even puts those into the plan. He says, I can use that too. My sins, yes. My faults, yes. What other people do, yes. God says, I can fit it all into the plan. And Paul knew this. And so he starts out, the first verse is verse 12, and he says this: now I want you to know, dear brothers and sisters, that everything that has happened to me has helped spread the good news. Now let me explain what's going on here. Ever since Paul had become a Christian on the road to Damascus, he had dreamed one great dream, and that was this: I want to preach in Rome. Rome is the center of the universe. Rome is the capital of the empire. Rome is the most prestigious, powerful, strategic city in the world. God had another idea. Paul, you're going to go as a prisoner, and I'm going to make you a royal prisoner of Caesar. Now, does anybody know who was Caesar at this point? Nero. You ever heard of that guy? Yeah, Nero. About as wicked and as bad as you can get. So Paul is a prisoner of Nero. And as a royal prisoner, with a royal guard chained to him 24 hours a day, He gets to talk to all kinds of key people he would never otherwise talk to because he's an important prisoner. He's chained 24 hours a day to a palace guard for 2 years. They changed that guard every 4 hours. So I added it up. Over 2 years, he witnessed to 4,380 guards. Now, my question is, who's the real prisoner here? Who has the captive audience? This is why Paul says, I want you to know, dear brothers and sisters, that everything that has happened to me, being in prison, has helped spread the good news. So he says, I've got my plan, but God has a bigger plan. And he says, I can be happy because I can see what God is doing through my problem. And when you face the problem in faith, 2 things will happen. Write these down. First, it's a witness to unbelievers. When Christians handle big problems in faith, it is a witness to unbelievers. That's why in verse 13 he says, for everyone here, talking about the palace guard and in the royal prison, everyone here, including all the soldiers in the palace guard, knows that I'm in chains because of Christ. Well, I guess so. He'd witnessed over 4,000 times to guys chained to him. It's a witness to unbelievers. Number 2, it's an encouragement to believers. In verse 14, he says this, and because of my imprisonment, many of the Christians here have gained confidence, those in Rome, and they've become more bold in telling others about Christ. It's a witness to unbelievers. It's an encouragement to believers. All right, number 2, second habit. I can be happy no matter what happens if I never let others control my attitude. And this is a good example of Paul gives us right here in this passage. I can be happy no matter what happens in my life if I never let others control my attitude. I don't let them decide whether I'm going to be happy or not. Now, Paul, in this next section, he talks about 4 kinds of people. And while he's in prison, he says, now there are some people who are attacking my ministry. They slandered Paul, they judged Paul, they criticized Paul, they were gossip mongers. There were some people who supported his ministry that were friends. There were some who competed with his ministry. They're trying to kick him while he's down. And there were some who were undermining his ministry. And they're even trying to destroy him. They're trying to rub it in. He's in prison. They're trying to make it more painful. And in Philippians chapter 1, verses 15 to 17, Paul describes 4 kinds of people. 3 of them are killjoys. One's a good kind. And he says, there are 4 kinds of people in my life. There are critics, who are slandering me and who are creating all kinds of controversy. There are comrades, that's my friends. There are competitors who are preaching Christ out of rivalry. And he said there are conspirators who just want to make my problem worse. They want to rub it in. They want to kick me while I'm down, while I'm in prison. They're my enemies. Now notice these verses there on your outline. First verse, this is verse 15, talking about critics. He says, it is true that some preach Christ because they are jealous and quarrelsome. Circle the word quarrelsome. That word in Greek is the word eris, E-R-I-S. And it means they love to argue. Have you ever met anybody like that? They love to argue. They love conflict. They enjoy creating controversy. They enjoy getting into a cat fight. These people are contentious. They are divisive. They are critical. Now notice that here he says they're jealous and they're quarrelsome. Notice that the critic's motive is usually jealousy. When people criticize something, they usually are jealous of it. But what he's saying here is, he says, I have to deal with these people, and would you agree that few things could rob your happiness faster than being criticized? When you're criticized at work, or you're criticized by friends, or you're criticized by neighbors, your stomach starts churning. Why? Because we all want to be loved. We all want to be approved. We want everybody to like us. But let me give you a little happiness hint, one of those little HHs. You might write this down. I don't need other people's approval to be happy. And then in the next verse, verse 16, he talks about the good guys. These are his friends. These are his comrades. He says, others preach Christ from genuine goodwill. And they do so out of love. That's the real reason we share the good news, out of love. And they know that God has given me the work of defending the gospel. So he says, those people bring me joy, obviously. And then in verse 17, he talks about another killjoy, competitors. He says, others preach Christ insincerely from a spirit of selfish ambition. Circle the phrase selfish ambition. And how do you know when somebody's ego-driven? They put other people down all the time to build themselves up. That's when you know somebody's ministering in selfish ambition. They feel compelled to put other people down in order to build themselves up. And then in the second part of verse 17, he talks about conspirators or enemies. These are people who just want to mess him up. He says, other people just want to stir up more trouble for me. And they want to add to my pain while I'm in prison. You know what is the favorite tool of crazy makers and troublemakers? Gossip. Gossip. Gossip is the number one sign of a troublemaker. The Bible says in the book of Proverbs that a person who gossips is as bad as a saboteur. They're an emotional terrorist. That's what the Bible says. You should not gossip. Now, you're going to have all four of these in your life. Critics, comrades, competitors, and conspirators. I certainly have. Don't let them rob you. Number 3. Here's the third habit. It's the next 3 or 4 verses 19 to 20. I can always be happy no matter what happens if I always trust God to work things out. I can always be happy no matter what happens if I always trust God to work things out. I don't try to work it out myself. When things are falling apart, I don't try to put them back together. I just let God put them back together. This is the faith factor. You've heard me say this before, that when you're going through a problem, you got 2 options. You can worship or you can worry. That's it. Worship or worry, worship or worry, worship or worry. And if you worshiped more, you'd have a whole lot less to worry about. You can pray or you can panic. And those are the options you've got. This is the faith factor. Paul says this in Philippians 1:19. I will continue to rejoice. Let's circle the phrase, I will. Will, that's an act of the will. It is your choice to rejoice. I don't care how bad things are in your life right now, it's your choice to rejoice. It's an act of the will. He says, I will continue to rejoice in spite of all the things that's going on that are bad. For I know, circle that, I'll come back and explain this in a minute. For I know that as you pray for me, circle pray for me, and as the Spirit of Jesus Christ helps me, circle that, Spirit of Jesus Christ help me, all that's happened will all turn out for my deliverance. Now this is a very powerful verse here. And in that one verse, Paul gives 4 sources of strength in tough times. You just circle them. 4 sources of strength. And this is how you stay positive. This is how you stay happy no matter what happens in your life. He says, first, my first source of strength is I have God's perspective on my problems. That's when he says, for I know. It's what you know that keeps you going. He says, I know God is working in this. I have God's perspective on my problems, for I know. And then he says, number 2, I have people praying for me. And he said, that keeps me going. And then he says, I have the Holy Spirit helping me. And that keeps me going. And then he says, I expect that I'm going to be delivered. So he says, I have faith that God will work it for good. And so I've got perspective, I've got prayer, I got the Holy Spirit, and I've got faith. And then he says, therefore, I choose to be happy. I will continue to rejoice. That's your choice, to rejoice. Finally, number 4. I can be happy no matter what happens in my life. If I look at every problem from God's viewpoint, if I never let other people control my attitude, if I always trust God to work things out, and number 4, if I stay focused on my purpose, not my problems. God's purpose for my life. If I stay focused on my purpose, not my problem, I can be happy even when life seems to be falling apart. I stay focused on my purpose, Paul says, not my problem. Now picture this. Paul is old. He's an old man now. He's in prison. He's a long way from home. He's in Rome. He is awaiting death by execution. These are not exactly normally happy times. And they have taken away everything from Paul. They've taken away his friends. They've taken away his freedom. They have taken away his ministry to travel around. They have even taken away his privacy. He's got a guard chained to him 24 hours a day. But there's one thing they cannot take away from Paul: his purpose. It cannot be taken away from him. And his ability to make choices. I never forget reading Viktor Frankl's book, in Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl was a Jewish psychiatrist who was taken to one of the Dachau, Auschwitz, Buchenwald death camps in Nazi Germany. And all of his family and all of his friends and everybody were being gassed and murdered and killed. And he said, I remember one day when we stood in front of the Gestapo, stark naked. They'd taken away our clothes. They'd even taken away my wedding ring. I stood there with nothing at all. And he said, all of a sudden I realized there was one thing they could not take away from me. And it was my choice in how I would respond. Nobody could take that away from me. I cannot control what other people do to me. I cannot control what other people do around me, but I can control how I respond. And Paul says, I'm going to stay focused on my purpose, even though they've taken away everything from. They could not take away his purpose. And what was his purpose? Serving God by serving others. The reason why most people are miserable is because they think that happiness comes from self-gratification. If I just get more possessions, if I get more pleasures, if I get more position, if I get sex, salary, status, if I get more things, if I live for myself, if I get better stuff for me, I'll be happier. That doesn't work. Actually, self-gratification is not the way to happiness. The way to happiness is self-sacrifice, not self-gratification. Paul says, the reason I'm happy is because as long as I'm alive, I'm giving my life away to help others. Are you doing that? Or are you living for yourself? If you're living for yourself, I can tell you right now, you're not very happy. You aren't. Because happiness does not come from status, and happiness does not come from salary, and happiness does not come from sex. Happiness comes from service and giving your life away. And until you understand that, you're not going to be happy much of your life. Happiness does not come from self-gratification. It comes from self-sacrifice. For me, to live is Christ. That's a pretty simple purpose. And to die is gain. Now let me ask you this. For me to live is Christ. If somebody came up to you today and asked you to fill in the blank, what word would you use? For me to live is entertainment. For me to live is sports, golf, baseball, football. For me to live is clothes. For me to live is make money. For me to live is my family. For me to live is friends. You see, there can be a lot of good things, but nothing deserves the place of for me to live except the one who created you and gave you your life, Jesus Christ. For me to live is Christ. And I want to say this, how you fill in that blank will determine how happy you are in life. Because if you say for me to live is money, you're going to be unhappy a lot of your life. For me to live as success, you're not going to be happy a lot of your life. For me to live as fame, pleasure, possession, position, power, prestige, there's nothing wrong with those things. They just don't deserve first place in your life. You weren't created to make a bunch of money, die, and give it away. No, God has a far greater purpose in your life. For me to live is Christ.